Dark Souls 3 is an action RPG that released in 2016 by the company From Software, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't extremely critical of it during that time. But was the game really that bad? Or was perhaps my attitude just at fault? If the game wasn't exactly like Dark Souls 1, it wouldn't be good enough. This is truly how I felt, and now I know that's the wrong frame of mind to be in when experiencing something new. Something that tries to branch out and attain its own being, despite the love it garnered in its original creation. Inevitably, I cast it aside as nothing more than a mediocre attempt at what I already considered near perfection. I knew though, deep down, I would ultimately have to face this game again, as the years went on and I began to see the faults in my old ways. And that day is today. This is Dark Souls 3, a very long 6 years later. In Dark Souls 3, you play as an Unkindled, often referred to by many as the Ashen One. The premise of the game is that the Age of Fire is soon coming to an end. In the prologue, it's told that a bell of awakening will sound when the first flame begins to fade, beckoning the Lords of Cinder to return to their thrones to extend the Age of Fire. However, the four lords have defied their duties and fled, unwilling to rekindle the flame. Only one answered the call, Ludlith of Courland, the diminutive pygmy lord with no legs, and you can find him sitting in his giant seat at Firelink Shrine. As the Ashen One, your job is to hunt the rest down and bring their charred remains to their own thrones in the shrine, allowing you to link the first flame and stave off the return of another age of darkness. The inscription of their cinders read, "If the lords will not return to their thrones themselves, let them return as cinders." Dark Souls 3 is a game of parallel cycles. The flame has faded and been rekindled many times in the past, and with this we can assume the Lords of Cinder have lost faith in their mission, one way or the other, and simply don't want to bear the painful ritual anymore. Thus the burden falls to the Ashen One, those who have attempted the deed in the past, yet were not powerful enough to rekindle it. When they failed, the flame burnt them to dust and turned them to ash, hence the name, Ashen One. This is why the game begins in the Cemetery of Ash. The Ashen One rises from its grave, awoken by the toll of the cemetery bells, signifying that the flame has begun to fade, marking the beginning of our champion's journey. One thing that I've always considered a weakness of Dark Souls 3 is its game structure. Though after going back to the game, I'm noticing so many more positives that's made me really reconsider how I feel about it. In terms of world design, Dark Souls 3 is madly linear, and it's not easy to think that this is an immediate disgrace of the game, based solely on the fact that it's not like Dark Souls 1. Dark Souls was wrapping, and there was a density to it that you can taste, a feeling of deep, dark adventure, mystery, and confusion, yet also a rather wonderful sense of cohesion. A combination that was very unique. You could go anywhere and do pretty much anything you wanted. That feeling of liberation and yet unity was a powerful sensation that prevailed much of the experience. The knock-on effects trickle down into the gameplay, I'm sure, which is why I think it led to the insane replayability of the game, allowing you to search out any item you wanted from the onset and kind of create your own adventure, create a route through the game, define your master plan, and execute what we call runs to make those visions come to life. You could have a completely different experience the second or third time around, given the open nature of the game. There was a marked feeling of instant freedom, hugging powerful, exciting adventure. Dark Souls 3 does not capture that feeling, nor does it try, which is an important thing to distinguish as we often put those expectations in front of our own eyes. It presents more or less a straight road from the beginning to the end, which many consider a wild departure from other From Software titles. However, this isn't entirely true. Every title has been different. There isn't one true standard. We've seen it all. Not a single template has been repeated. Hub worlds and level selections, cohesive wrapping worlds, teleportation, giant open worlds, and in the case of Dark Souls 3, a mostly linear format. Dark Souls 3's linear game route is peppered with occasional forks in the road that branch out to additional areas. However, they are only one-way forks. They never loop around, they don't curve or connect to any other areas via the brilliant shortcuts we've seen in the original, nor do they give you alternate routes through the game. They inevitably just dead end, forcing you back to where the road initially forked. This is where I think Dark Souls 3 kinda gets a bad rap. For example, when you defeat the Crystal Sage at the Road of Sacrifice, you have two options. You can go to Faron Keep, trek through the swamp, and defeat the Abyss Watchers. Or you can go to the Cathedral of the Deep and fight the Deacons. When you kill them though, you have to backtrack to the original fork in the road and continue to Faron Keep anyways. The cathedral doesn't connect to any other areas or wrap back around. There's really no choice in the matter anyway, as the cathedral contains an item that you must attain. So the choice isn't do you want to go to the cathedral, but rather do you want to go now or later. There are 4 more offshoot paths you can take. The Smoldering Lake, which is an optional area you can go to after defeating High Lord Wolnir. There's nothing really to write home about this area, and the ballista on the mountaintop makes the whole thing more or less a hassle than anything else. Anor Londo, available after finishing Boreal Valley, is another split path. This is a required area, so like the cathedral, it's simply a matter of when you want to do it, not if you want to do it. Obviously, this is fanfare, and Dark Souls 3 is guilty of this quite a bit. It's a nice service to veterans to bring back Anor Londo, and it allows the devs to recycle old content architecture, but it doesn't hold up to the original at all. Thankfully, we get to fight Aldridge, a boss I really enjoyed. Third is the Archdragon Peak after the completion of Irithyll Dungeon, which is a completely optional area featuring one of the game's most challenging bosses. And lastly, you can go to the Consumed King's Gardens to fight Osarios, which will lead you to the Unintended Graves. Again though, this isn't really based on exploration per se. You come to these areas to fight the 2 bosses, and warp back to Lothar Castle before heading to the Grand Archives. There's really no deviation from this whatsoever. The choice is yours to deviate, but it's simply content that you either want to optionally do or not. The only other divergence you can take as the player is to kill Emma, the High Priestess, which gives instant access to the Dancer of Boreal Valley fight. Afterwards, you can then explore various late game areas, which is great for picking up certain items and upgrade materials. However, this isn't really a viable option for most people, as it has both narrative consequences and also because the Dancer fight is just way too hard for a low level player. Not to mention the areas that come after are a complete nightmare for the ill-equipped, so I don't even really consider this an option for most people. Other than these specific cases, there are very little if any other choices to the game route. Initially, I was prepared to feel rather let down, with the constrictions of this linearity, knowing that I was going to be forced down a very, very predetermined path. But something quite different came out of my experience this time around. The first thing I noticed was an incredibly pristine difficulty curve. The balance of enemies and bosses in Dark Souls 3 is so sharp, and if you don't agree, I really encourage you to replay the game, as you'll likely see what I mean. It simply has the cleanest sense of fairness and progression to any Dark Souls game, because it's linear. The progression and the challenge, even though there's very little choice in the game route, is gradual, because it can be controlled. Yet the game overall is consistently challenging, which is a very hard balance to find between the 2 elements. After the initial Udic Gundyr fight, which is more or less here to weed out the weak, From Software just loves these sort of get-good scare tactics. Father Gascoigne in Bloodborne is another example. The rest of the game just has excellent pacing and challenge. There's a sense of natural escalation. Each area is just a little bit harder, a little bit more intricate, with just a little bit harder of a boss. When you design a linear game, you know about how powerful the average player is going to be, more or less at all times. There's little guesswork when areas are locked off, items are controlled through gating mechanics, and bosses must be completed in a preordained fashion. This is a huge benefit to a game balancer, as you can better estimate enemy health pools and damage numbers for bosses, and design areas that expand on the expectations of the player, because you know beyond any doubt a range at which people will be. When you add up all of those tailor-made incremental challenges, you have a game that isn't defined by its oppressive difficulty, but one of fair and crescent challenge. This is literally the opposite of my experience with Elden Ring, a game I love, but also one that was a gauntlet of nightmarish difficulty spikes, followed by comically easy bosses. A game that I was either breezing through, or pulling my hair out, as the insanity of some of its bosses burned a hole through my soul. An open game is impossible to balance, as the entire world can be farmed and worked through in an incalculable amount of ways. Another benefit of Dark Souls 3's linearity is that navigation is easier. At no point does any frustration occur or set in regards to where to go, and with the increased amount of bonfires, figuring out the game route isn't too hard. Dark Souls 2 was plagued with the "where the hell do I go" feeling. This obviously though is a double-edged sword, as we lose a little bit of that feeling of wanderlust, and naturally, some agency to define our own adventure. But then again, we cannot criticize a game for not doing something. That's like saying I don't like my new pair of Nikes because they don't have the shoelace design from my old pair of Nikes. That says literally nothing about your new pair of shoes. You should probably be asking, Do I like my new shoelace design? Why or why not? And for Dark Souls 3, the linear format works just fine for this game. Perhaps not for replayability, which is a black mark in itself, but the game functions very well, giving a clear path from start to finish with proper balance that tests you appropriately at every step of the way. Dark Souls 3 is tough, but because it's linear, it doesn't fall victim to overly tuned bosses or chaotic difficulty spikes. There wasn't a single boss or moment I belabored over or raged over. In fact, I completed the game with all the DLC in just 19 hours. And I had, mostly, a great and memorable time with it. If there's a problem that I had with the game in terms of the structure, it isn't the linearity. It's the fact that there is a sway in quality as you play through the various areas. And because it's linear, you can't avoid the areas that you do not enjoy. The High Wall of Lothric is a very good introductory level. It's complicated enough to appease longtime fans with its verticality, ambushes, optional NPC key runback mini-quest, and proper shortcuts, yet accessible to newcomers as it has essentially one main path to the end, where you can't really get lost. You might die a lot as a first timer, but you always will be pushing in the right direction, which is important. It's not the masterpiece of Central Yharnam, but overall it's pretty solid and does a good job teaching players the fundamentals of the game, such as combats, healing management, and shortcuts. The game then moves on to the Undead Settlement, which is definitely one of the best levels in the game. It's a huge, twisting level chock full of interesting mechanics and stories. The scale of it is intimidating, but it's so well interlaced with wraparounds, hidden shortcuts, and dense building placement. The combination is perfect for a Souls game. There are so many paths to explore that you could easily lose track of where you're at, which isn't something great for navigating an entire world, but inside an isolated level, it's what we often crave, as when we finally circle back to where it connects, you have that okay, this makes sense now moment. There's a pit of hollows to fall into, a rat tunnel shortcut, a secret giant fight, a secret non-hostile NPC you can use to teleport to a new area, several other NPCs you can meet, and a big boss to fight at the end. Pretty much checks all the boxes for a pretty good Souls level, so that's 2 good areas in a row. You're pumped for what's next, and it's the Road of Sacrifices, which is alright but definitely doesn't live up to the prior areas, as it's more of a transitionary area. You then move on to the Cathedral or Farron Keep, as I mentioned before. The swamp leading to Farron Keep is just awful, and I don't know why these abrasive swamp areas keep making their way into Souls games. It's not that they're not fun to explore, it's the fact that you're poisoned and can barely move. New players are not going to have the poison bite ring most likely, especially when it's located in the Cathedral, which a lot of the players will be doing after Farron Keep anyway, so what the hell. Swamps can be done a lot better than this anyway. You only need to look at the swamp in the Ring City DLC. It serves the same purpose, wide open circle with a variety of obstacles and enemies, but you're not poisoned and you can run at full speed. The resulting gameplay isn't impeded for the sake of gimmicks. It's also kinda dumb, sorry I just don't have a better word for it, that they put a bunch of trees in the Farron Swamp which blocks out the view of the fire towers. These are what guide you to the furnaces you need to put out in order to open the big gate to get to the keep. Like, why? The Cathedral of the Deep, though, is an incredible area, marking a pattern in Dark Souls 3 of okay level, great level, okay level, great level. The Cathedral has some of the best shortcut usage in any level. It's also vast and complex, with nooks and crannies everywhere to check. Sadly, it culminates in a Deacon fight, which is an interesting spin, but ultimately isn't spectacular. Gimmick fights like the Deacons, Yorm the Giant, or Mikolash are completely fine the first time through, as they're sort of like puzzles you need to figure out. But they are always the ones that you loathe a second time around because you either know the tactic or you don't. If you know it, the fight is trivialized, and if you don't, it's a headache. There's nothing in the middle. For me, the best fights are always going to be the ones that are based on mechanical skill, and in the case of Dark Souls 3, that means solid sword fighting, great movesets, and a fair challenge. One only needs to look at the Ancient Wyvern fights in the Archdragon Peak area. It's just one of the most lame bosses in the entire game because it quite literally has none of that. Farron Keep fares better in the boss department with the Abyss Watchers, which is the first true test since Udic Gundyr. This is one of the multi-enemy boss fights in the game, and while it slows down the pace of the fight to have to fight 2 enemies, I'd never say that these encounters are unfair. given the cleaner and more responsive combat system of Dark Souls 3. The multi-bosses in Dark Souls 2 were definitely less successful in this capacity. Camera problems plagued positioning, slow movement made them frustrating, and lower stamina regeneration drew out fight length. Dark Souls 3 does not have those issues. More invincibility frames when rolling, and being able to heal while moving also gives that little bit of extra smoothness and quickness to compensate. And the Watchers are an example of a very fair multi-enemy throwdown. The music score is evocative, the arena is large and spacious, and the moveset of the Watchers is both fair and complex. It's not a pushover, but it's not painfully oppressive either. It's an excellent fight that highlights why Dark Souls 3 has the best boss battles of any game in the catalog. Multi-enemy bosses are always going to be somewhat of an issue though, as they create a process of AI management more than overcoming a tough enemy. The real goal here is to manipulate the enemies by exhausting their entire combos before going on the offensive. For the most part, Dark Souls 3 does a good job at these fights, as they typically have one enemy programmed to be rather passive and one being aggressive. If not, they at least have different movesets that keep them at different distances from you, which is really important. Father Ariandel in the Freed fights and the Gravetender fights from the DLC are two really good examples of this, with the former being one of the best fights in the entire game, period. So once again, we're on this high after killing the Watchers, so we trek through the catacombs, which does have an impressive atmosphere. Dark Souls 3 can look absolutely gorgeous, dark and immersive with the proper reshade filter, and I have mine set to be as dark as possible in case you were wondering. The world looks so much more interesting than the dull grey vanilla version, and you have to assume the only reason it looks so faded out is to make it slightly more accessible to the masses, and that was actually one of the reasons that kind of turned me off initially. As I said, this game is a series of hot and cold moments though. We find ourselves back in the gutter with High Lord Wolnir next, which is another insanely easy gimmick fight, which doesn't really serve any purpose to test our skills, and it's definitely one of the low points in the game. Kudos for the dark presentation and the spook factor, but this is not a Dark Souls boss you'd ever rave over. Thankfully, we climb the ladder after defeating him and are greeted by a pristine, frosty view of Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. Boreal Valley is everything you want from a Dark Souls game. Of course, it's beautiful in its ethereal glass-like state, but from a position of level design, it is perfect. Up until this point, the levels have been fairly straightforward. Sure, there were some shortcuts to find and you'd occasionally get lost for a brief moment, but nothing too elaborate. This all changes with Irithyll, an incredibly intricate, huge area full of tons of optional paths and things to see. It resembles a maze. And if you branch off the beaten path, the game does a great job rewarding you with really cool items. It's also more challenging with several new harder hitting enemy types and groups that pretty much all fight differently. From Software does a very smart thing here as well, introducing invisible enemies and audio cues for hidden items and ambushes. These floating glowing eyes are something you need to watch out for. This ensures the pace slows down, which helps you keep your bearings in a level that already begs to be explored carefully, a thoughtful approach on the part of the development team. Capped off with a brilliant shortcut that makes you speechless when you realize where it dumps you off at, and a tremendous boss to follow. This is the perfect Dark Souls level and offers the ideal set of qualities we're looking for. If I had to wager the boss that gave most people their first true ass whooping, I think it would be Pontiff Sulyvahn. The presentation is awesome, the giant church, the haunting choir music, the huge dual-wielding flaming swords, and the awesome fast movesets. No gimmicks, nothing unfair, just a kick-ass classic Souls duel. The mirror mechanic in the second phase is also quite interesting, not unfair as it has a very low HP count. Above all else, it's a proper exciting sword fight, highlighting the best parts about the combat system. Before we jump into the next section, thanks to Factor for sponsoring this video. Factor is a meal service that delivers ready-made meals to your doorstep. When I was putting this video together for you guys, it was 101 degrees all week long, so cooking was not an option. And being on a plant-based diet, I have basically zero food options around where I live for takeout. Factor came in clutch and saved me a crap ton of time. The meals are never frozen and designed by professional chefs and dietitians. They've got a ton of options from keto, vegetarian, vegan, and more. The tomato risotto with veggies and pine nuts was actually really good, and the best part was we didn't have any mess, no dirty dishes, and all the packaging was recyclable. Not to mention my house didn't have to heat up like a volcano. And as someone who spends far too much time in the kitchen, I can absolutely recommend Factor. If you guys are interested in trying Factor, you can use my link or go to go.factor75.com and use code POGDOWN120 for $120 off across 5 boxes. And now, back to the show. Combat in Dark Souls 3 can best be thought as a game of rhythm. The system is based around what's called input buffering. Input buffering is a game mechanic that takes an input you did after one action, stores it, and then executes it as soon as the first action ends. However, in order for the second input to be stored, you have to wait a split second after you press the first button to make sure it gets queued up in line. Hitting R1 rapid fire will cause the Ashen One to attack only once, because I didn't wait long enough for the game to register that second swing. But if I space out my inputs by a fraction of a second, the second attack will come out. What's challenging at first is that input overlap is prevalent when executing attack strings, which means that an input can overwrite a previous input if your timing is not correct. Of course, I'm referring to button mashing. For instance, if you want to do a 2-hit light combo and then roll afterwards, but hit the roll button too soon after your second light attack because you panicked, the roll will then override that second light attack. This is why it's very easy to see new players messing up their attacks and roll options and dying for it. Here's another more intricate example. This broadsword's weapon art is an upward strike, and you use it by holding the L2 button and then pressing R2 afterwards. If I want to perform a light attack and then use my weapon art, I know my inputs are as follows: R1, L2 hold, and R2. If I time it correctly, I can squeeze out that weapon art a little bit faster than I would normally be able to, and that's kind of the purpose. However, if you're not careful, you can hit that R2 button too soon, and the heavy attack has the potential to override the weapon art. You can actually see my character attempt the weapon art here. The animation begins to start, but my heavy attack simply overrides it. You probably won't ever need to do this combo. The point is that you have to be very careful what buttons you press in this game and always make sure never to mash. These windows can be quite insane as it depends on the animations of your initial attack. For example, watch how fast I input this basic combo with Pontiff's curved sword. L2, R1. Just look at how early I can hit R1 after I hit L2 and have the R1 attack still come out. It's crazy, and it really shows you that you should not be spamming buttons in this game. It's hard because the buffering creates a natural form of lag that is difficult to get used to, but as you continue to play the game, not only does it become second nature, but it also makes you play better as well, especially with its uncapped frame rate on PC, which does a lot to create a more fluid landscape for play overall. The system is very interesting because every attack has a different speed, so the timings will not be universal unless the weapon is of the same weapon class. Equipping a dagger really makes you appreciate the buffering system because the timings are so sharp, and it's really easy to get lost in what you're doing if you execute a long string of attacks. It's a very unforgiving system, especially when you realize there are very few canceling options for weapon attacks in Dark Souls 3. For example, if I hold R2 to perform a charge-up attack, there is nothing I can do to back out of it. I can store a dodge or Estus buffer behind it, but it will not cancel the attack. Pressing buttons within the animation results in absolutely nothing. Again, this means be careful about mashing buttons. The only canceling mechanic I was able to find is with magic, in which you can start casting a spell and then immediately cancel it into a dodge, which is actually kind of handy. You can even carry the soft animation through an infinite roll, which is funny to watch. It's interesting you cannot cancel spellcasts into any other actions but the dodge, which makes you wonder why this is the case, and it has some implications for the battle mage type character setups. On a side note, the switch to an FP-based magic system I think overall was a very smart choice. This is a little bit debatable, but this is my take on it. In the past, you had a dedicated number of uses for each spell if you were playing a magic character, replenished only if you rested at a bonfire. With the new system, you get a mana bar and you use potions to refill it. This means that with the new system, you can spam a single spell as much as you want to, as long as you bring enough Ashen Estus, cutting out the need to fall back on crappy spells if you run out. This is pretty important in PvE because you usually have one main spell you'll be using most of the time and a few others situationally, which means you'd rather have a mana bar system that you can use to create that optimization on the fly. Where in Dark Souls 2, for example, you'd have to attune your best spell in more slots than one to be optimal. This means you can kill every single enemy with spells alone and never have to worry about using melee weapons, yet still have enough spellcast left for the boss. And because you have full control over your mana bar, you don't feel as shackled to the attunement stat, since you can pick your favorite one or two spells and prioritize more Ashen as opposed to dumping tons of points into attunement. However, the attunement is also at the same time more flexible. It has more uses than just being for spell slots, since you get focus points for each point invested. This makes leveling attunement ultimately less discouraging, since you no longer need to level up 5 times to see an improvement. And because you can cancel spellcasts with rolling, as I mentioned earlier, it gives you the leeway to take on some of the harder challenges with magic alone. The proper way to play Dark Souls 3 is to view it as a fighting game, and be prepared to face the consequences of your actions if you don't. Dark Souls 2 had more canceling options, Elden Ring gives you way more flexibility. Dark Souls 3 is a straight up sword fighting action game unless you're playing a mage. I like to think good technique is the equivalent of tapping. You want to tap only the buttons you need to and nothing more. Dark Souls 3 is personified as a game for hard-hitting attacks, combos, and more importantly, delays. Delays have become an incredibly big part of Souls games over the years, for better or worse, and the goal has always been the same, to throw off predictability. Sometimes it's fun to study boss patterns and figure out the timings, other times it feels cheap, especially when some delay attacks carry the same exact wind-up animations as other attacks that do not have the delay function built in. The interesting part about delays though is that although they can hurt the player, they can also help them. Obviously if you dodge too soon, a delay attack will hit you, and if you're on low stamina, a follow-up combo can straight up kill you. However, that delay window can also inadvertently save your life. In this clip, I commit the classic Souls sin of running out of stamina, so I'm going to die to this next attack guaranteed. However, it's a delay attack, which gives me just enough time to regen enough stamina to roll out of the way. Pretty interesting when you apply it to the other mechanics of Dark Souls 3's combat system. The delay attacks themselves though in Dark Souls 3 aren't nearly as punishing as a game like Elden Ring, and there's lots of reasons for this, but primarily it's because they're easier to detect. There's less screen noise and far less particle effects and magical clutter coming from the bosses. If I had to put a word on it, most bosses in Dark Souls 3 have very clean, telegraphed attacks, and it's really fun to feel like you have proper duels in this game. The buffering system keeps you honest, bosses are not sponges, and they don't have lightning-fast sprinting attacks or teleport all over the screen without you being able to react. Invincibility frames are also cleaner. There's few, if any, one-shot mechanics if you have a decent amount of health, and next to zero spell-crippling moments where you die to some horseshit creeping poison on the ground that came from a mile away. Again, f this fight from Elden Ring. Enemy stamina is also mostly in check. This will always be somewhat of a problem in Souls, the feeling that the most powerful enemies shouldn't be able to mercilessly attack you without taking a breather. However, the increased speed of Dark Souls 3 and the more generous stamina regeneration feels like it somewhat equalizes it. The game is still tricky, and various fights use different music tempos to throw you off with those delay attacks, like the dancer fights. Yet overall, Dark Souls 3 is very fair. It's fun, it focuses on epic duels that get increasingly more challenging and interesting as the game goes on, which is exactly what it should be doing. All the while providing some amazing boss arenas, catchy dark music, and fun mechanics to fight against, like Pontiff. We next enter Irithyll Dungeon, kill Yorm at the Profane Capital, and head over to Archdragon Peak to round out this section of the game. After Boreal Valley, these sections do feel quite disappointing as a whole. 2 of the 3 bosses are gimmicks, and the dungeon is basically a discount version of the Tower of Latria from Demon Souls. It's got a great shortcut moment, but the jailer enemies are pretty cheap. They make for a great scare moment, but that's about it. The dungeon leads to the Profane Capital, and it's a shame how small this place is given a Lord of Cinder resides here, and it's easily a place where you beat it and then soon forget about it. The Dragon Age Peak is an area I quite like, though when you compare it to Dragonary from Dark Souls 2 it doesn't hold a candle. Beautiful, but there's lots of annoying enemies and a dreadfully boring gimmick boss. Thankfully though, the Nameless King is the final boss of the area and provides one of the best fights in the entire game. Throughout my entire playthrough, I was constantly asking myself why I was having such an easy time with this game. I thought about it for a long time and I came up with 2 things. I'm no longer an idiot, and Elden Ring. My mechanical skill and patience has improved a lot since my first Dark Souls 3 playthrough, and Elden Ring really kicked my ass. It definitely honed my reactions and made me more focused, and I consider it by far the hardest From Software game outside of Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. I don't want to say Dark Souls 3 is easy, but compared to Elden Ring, for me it was a cakewalk. There were so many moments where I knew I had struggled in the past, and I mean badly, yet I breezed through. I remember this little section with these screaming birds being agony, and this fight here, these winged knights on this rooftop, torture. I can guarantee you I never killed these guys. I remember the dancer fight being quite literally impossible without a co-op summon, and I never beat the Nameless King. Hell, I didn't even make it to the end. 5 years ago, Dark Souls 3 was just way too hard. But something clicked this playthrough. Every single boss was a beatdown. Believe me, I was shocked, and I'm not trying to brag, I am a very intermediate gamer. But I made Dark Souls 3 my bitch. I beat the dancer on my first try, with 4 Estus flasks. Yeah, you know how you can activate the fight accidentally without stopping at the bonfire? Guilty. But I rolled her over. It was an amazing fight. The unsettling violin music, her graceful ballerina-type moveset. It was so awesome to duel her straight up. No gimmicks, nothing, just you and the boss. Easily top 5 bosses in this game. I entered the Nameless King fight, assuming I would get demolished, but I killed him on my first attempt. It wasn't easy, but I was surprised that he didn't kick the crap out of me. This is another boss fight that is perfectly adapted to the Souls format. Huge, intimidating boss, epic arena, thunderous music, and the movesets. They're just plain fun to fight against. A boss that also solves a lot of the gripes I had with some of the Elden Ring bosses. He actually has a health pool that's fair, his moves are telegraphed well, and he has a realistic amount of stamina. Playing Elden Ring definitely helped me fly through Dark Souls 3, and having a good build was also a plus. I went with a quality build with a straight sword. Nothing fancy, just basic rings and a decent shield too. I wouldn't consider it the best build, but I upgraded consistently. I prioritized vigor and endurance, and I was able to make it to the end of the game with all the DLC complete with just the Irithyll straight sword. If I'm being honest, I like sparkly stuff, and I wanted to use the sword because of the snowy particle effects. What it did though, I think, was free up my mental as well to focus on the game and perfect my dodge technique. When you don't have to flick through a bunch of spells or weapon swap while you fight, you can more actively get in tune with what's happening, react better, and just focus on the task at hand. It's the beauty of having a simple build. And honestly, overall I had a phenomenal time, which was shocking to me considering I actually at one point thought this was the quintessential worst Souls game, period. And I have to circle back to the outstanding difficulty curve brought on by that often bastardized linear game route. Great, snappy gameplay helps, but inside a vacuum that isn't good enough. I wonder though, was I having a great time because I wasn't suffering? Is a game more enjoyable when you're winning than losing? This is something I've been thinking about lately, and in the competitive world of gaming, I always enjoy myself more when I'm not getting crapped on. But with a single-player game, you remove that sense of person-to-person rivalry. It's fun to play a challenging single-player game, and dying is part of the process. You learn, you adapt, you overcome. But sometimes, From Software games like Elden Ring are so hard that it becomes just too much. And when it does, it really drags down the experience. When you finally overcome the challenge, you feel elation, but sometimes it doesn't quite make up for the feeling of being battered and broken for hours on end simply because the game just isn't properly balanced or tuned right. I'd love to know how you feel about this topic in the comments if you have a thought. With the Nameless King slain, we've officially entered the final section of Dark Souls 3, which is Lothric Castle, the Grand Archives, and the final boss. We'll take a quick detour to kill the optional bosses in the Unintended Graves and the King's Garden, which are fun, but not necessary if you just want to finish the game. Lothric Castle is delightful, at least artistically. You climb the stairs and reach the first barrack, and see the giant pygmy butterflies sailing atop the castle sky. To your left is a beautiful Fanta orange skyline, the once glorious sun now transformed into a dark sign. Flags breezing in the wind, you soon realize the importance of your mission. The darkness is coming, the sun has been eclipsed, and the fire is fading. It feels like shit is about to hit the fan. It's sad that the castle itself isn't used as much as the outdoor area. This isn't Stormville Castle here. It provides a great challenge and the environmental design is superb, with the wide range of enemies and altitudes making it interesting enough, but I would have preferred a proper castle here. We do get a great boss fight though. The epic duel with the Dragon Slayer is awesome thanks to a few interesting touches, such as that destructible terrain which he can slam into and destroy, which looks really cool. And the pygmy butterflies that shoot homing demon flames at you. Normally this fight would be problematic in a game like Dark Souls 2, which lacks proper audio cues with fights like the twin dragon riders, but here you can clearly hear when the projectiles are coming, which eliminates the need to use the free motion camera, allowing you to focus on fighting the boss, and not the boss arena. Finally, we move on to the Grand Archives, which I would put as a tie with Irithyll as the single best area in the game. There's a lot going on with this level, and the focus on verticality and shortcuts is absolutely genius. And there's no crutch bonfires, once again leaving me speechless when I opened up the shortcut. Often the best Souls levels have less bonfires, but more shortcuts, and the Archives embodies this. With new enemy types, lots of hidden items, and an outdoor area that connects it all together, it feels like the most complete level in the game. And it's rare for an area in any Souls game to nail all of its important elements. Varied enemy encounters, clever shortcuts, illusory walls, top-tier level design, immersive environmental detail and mechanics, a la dipping your head in the candle wax, and an epic boss. Typically you can find a fault with every level in any Souls game, but the Archives seems to check every box, saving the absolute best part about this level to the last, the Twin Princes. I can't explain how f***ing cool this design of the boss is. They're a striking duo, Lorien hobbling on crippled legs and mute, Lothric riding on his shoulders, a miniature prince, hood and cloak covering his eyes, looking like a ragged beggar, which is perfect considering he now curses the throne. When Lorien falls, Lothric jumps to his aid, reviving him with a beam of light. It fits in perfectly with the lore, which tells the story of Lothric, too weak and frail to link the flame when he was young. So Lorien offered his soul so he could be strong enough, which left him in the maimed state we find him in, yet inseparable from his brother, which is why we cannot kill Lorien unless we kill Lothric first. Mechanically, it's completely unique. Never has a Souls game put two enemies together in such a way that they are in the same hitbox, but they act independent. Lorien wields his flaming sword with perfectly readable swings that are extremely fun to dodge and punish, Lothric brandishing the light magic, teleporting the couple across the well-spaced out room. When they appear, he summons a blade of light that becomes one with Lorien's sword, syncing their attacks together, all while the best music in the soundtrack blares above you. Bosses in video games seldom get as epic as this. One of the things I kept feeling as Dark Souls 3 went on was a sadness that I couldn't fight these bosses again. The network features were down in May and June, which is when I was capturing this footage. Barring a New Game Plus, I couldn't revisit my favorite fights via co-op. I was left feeling like I wanted more. But I guess that's a good sign when you can't get enough of a game's best form of content. Really though, Dark Souls 3 does something no other game in the catalog does, which is deliver an absolutely breathtaking final section of the game. If we omit the two optional areas that connect to Lothric Castle, the last stretch of the game is a superb grouping of content. Far too many Souls games either fizzle out at the end or lose their quality. Dark Souls 1 gets praise to heaven and back, but the final areas of the game were not very good. If anything, Dark Souls 3 leaves the best for last. The only other game in the series with a similar sense of escalating tension, brilliant bosses, and truly fun areas leading to a conclusion is Demon's Souls. It's rare for a game to continually get better, and while the middle section of the game leaves a little bit to be desired, the upper end is the highest peak in entertainment and sheer Souls mastery. Lothric Castle, Irithyll, the Grand Archives, and the Prince Climax, all of these amazing bosses and places, and the showdown with the Lord of Cinder, an extremely fun fight. It's all there and then some, with the DLC awaiting you thereafter, which also ends on the highest of highs, with the absolute triumph that is the Ring City. You can make an argument that the Ashes of Ariandel DLC isn't the strongest piece of content, and you probably wouldn't be wrong. It has one of the most amazing bosses, with Fried, which is one of the best in the entire game, and a genuinely awesome backstory within that character, but the rest of the DLC, it does fall a bit flat. It's frankly far too short, and the length barely validates the cost. If you're only going to have 2 bosses, then they had better be the best 2 bosses you can possibly put out. And only one is. The enemies as well, these simply aren't that fun to fight either. The trees in the snowfield are pretty obnoxious. The huge packs of Milkwood Knights and wolves too, I mean they've always been some of the most annoying enemies in every single Souls game ever. The lore of Ariandel is pretty interesting with the painting girl, but somehow it just doesn't have the majesty the rest of the game carries. Despite the frosty beauty, I wasn't terribly impressed with Ariandel. Which is okay, because I forgot all about it when I ventured into the Ringed City, the pinnacle of Dark Souls 3's level design. The Ringed City is simply a dream. Having never played, I was stunned at the visuals. You get dropped off atop the mountain by the gargoyles, a lemon yellow sunset is bursting, kissing the green city in a seductive, fuzzy haze. The city looks old and lost, as it should. It is the last city after all. The title card fades in, and you know you're in for something special. I felt like I was playing Uncharted, and I just found Shangri-La. Never has a Souls area just looked so magnificent. It also happens to be the best zone in the entire game, sprawling into a series of different challenges. From the inner city, to the swamp that doesn't poison or slow you, to the finale with Gale. It's here that you see why this game is revered for its individual level designs, even down to single buildings. Take this one room for example. As we descend these stairs, we approach the cathedral as a new monk enemy runs out from the building. This small touch of isolating a new enemy with the player before introducing more complex groups of enemies or challenges allows the player to learn the new mechanic fairly. These monks have a spell that creates a halo on the ground, and if you stand in it, you take a lot of damage very fast. The goal is to burst the monk before he can turtle up and cast the spell. You can imagine various scenarios this spell would create when adding more enemies or putting them inside claustrophobic areas. So once we kill the first one, we enter this building, and it's here you see one of these scenarios play out. The building has 3 levels. The upper level has 2 monks and a staircase leading down to the lower level, which has a patrolling ringed knight. In the mid-level is another monk. So we have 4 enemies total. We have 3 monks and 1 ringed knight. As the player, we can approach this scenario in any way we want to, but the best way is to quickly kill the 2 monks on the upper level, which isn't easy since they constantly spam the tracking halos, and then jump onto the chandelier to reach the mid-level. You then need to jump to reach the 3rd monk, and if you don't act fast enough, the AoE circle will kill you immediately. Once you kill it, there's a perfectly placed ledge in which you can do a plunging attack onto the knight, something you couldn't do if you simply ran past the upper level. I can't begin to describe how well this was thought out, and over the course of the DLC, you'll find lots of interesting creative encounters with new enemies and some of the most beautiful tile sets and architecture that From has ever made. The Ringed City story ties it all together in an epic way that sends off the franchise just lovely. It continues the story of Gale in the Painted World, a world that is rotting, kept alive by the blood of its denizens. Gale is a slave knight who has been searching for the Ashen One to help him burn the painting so that a new one can be made. The story of Dark Souls 3's base game is one about preservation, preserving the flame. Here it is a process of purification, which is a breath of fresh air concerning lore, since it's basically an opposite. So you destroy Fried and Father Ariandel. Can we just stop for a second and give it up for the Scream designer at From Software? This guy is absolutely killing it. But something is still missing. The pigment is what the painter needs to complete her painting. Say that 5 times fast, huh? So Gale goes in search of it to the Ringed City in the end of time. There he finds not what he was looking for, that what she seeks has dried up, and in his quest he becomes fanatical. He slaughters the pygmy lords of the Ringed City. He then consumes them and eats their dark souls, causing him to become mutated and deformed.
Hand it over, that thing, your dark soul. For my lady's painting.
So we venture out into the Ring City ourselves and defeat him in what I can only describe as the single best fight in any From Software game. It is a fight that is vicious and fair and exciting and exploding with emotion, and when we defeat him we collect the blood of the Dark Soul, to which we can then give to the Painter, all the way back in Ashes of Ariandel, finishing Gale's story from Ariandel to the Ring City, a single story to bridge both DLCs. The Painter awaits in the attic of the burning chapel, flames rising from the floor, and says that she'll name her new painting Ash, and 'twill be a
cold, dark, and very gentle place. And one day, it will make someone a goodly home.
Sadly, never to learn the fates of her dear Gale, though it's probably for the best. I've always been intrigued at the stories of Dark Souls games, but I've never really put in the effort to find them until now, and the process gave me one of the most rewarding experiences I've ever had with a game. On the surface, the Souls games are abstract at best and incomprehensible at worst, but that's only a view held by those who don't stop to smell the roses. It may take a very patient person to sift through the fog, or dedicate time to the many NPC quest chains, which are often very hidden. But Dark Souls 3 deserves your attention. It's an exercise in deduction and investigation you must go on to unveil the fine details, which draws you in close to the story because you have to reach out for it. This is why Souls games cannot be replicated no matter how many times they try. There's an inherent breakdown in the information exchange. It's almost a sadistic way of playing a game in itself, and thus, it is not for everyone. But that's also what makes it beautiful and rich and rewarding internally, and it's something I have come to continually adore with these games. My time with Dark Souls 3 in 2022 has left me in a state of complete shock, and now, 6 years later, my opinion has completely changed. I now consider it worthy of being called one of the best Souls games, all of which I've had a renowned appreciation for these past few years. My main gripe, its linearity, I no longer see as the weakness I thought it once was. The journey from start to finish was epic, and it was fantastic, despite my main critique earlier being that there are a few levels that don't live up to the expectations of its best. But great moments follow again and again, tremendous worlds full of enjoyable content and excellent level design, capped off with the best boss design in the franchise and a final stretch that cannot be rivaled. There are a few things that I think could have gone better, but they don't exactly impede the game in any meaningful way. The main one being, Fashion Souls is dead in Dark Souls 3. The armor sets don't speak to me, and even if they did, having equip load tied to the vitality stat means that you couldn't wear the armor you wanted to anyway. It's much better to tie equip load to another stat players will already be investing in, such as endurance. That way, as you level endurance, you'll gradually open more options for wearing armor and weapons that you want to, while at the same time getting more stamina, which is something we already know players will be working towards. Seeing as how you get those items over the course of a playthrough, it just naturally makes sense. Vitality creates a system where the ability to equip what you want is basically binary. If you have a lot of vitality, you can, but if you don't, you can't. If you don't level vitality, which is otherwise a fairly wasted stat, you can't even equip a heavy piece of armor and a great sword. And don't even think about equipping a great shield, or a backup weapon or a staff. It's simply not going to happen. This forces players to equip the Havel's Ring and the Ring of Favor, which puts an unnecessary limitation on build crafting. It does solve the issue of giving everyone access to heavy armor, but that also has implications for PvP, and frankly the middle ground would have been to just eliminate stats for armor as Elden Ring did. That way everyone can use the items they want to without having advantages in PvP, while still having players have to respect the equip load system. Weapon diversity is something that could have used a little bit more love as well. Dark Souls 3 removed power stancing and homogenized a lot of the in-class weapon animation suites. I believe they thought the weapon art system would be a little bit more used than I think it was. But this was handled far better in Elden Ring with the use of the Ashes of War system, which gives far more freedom to build crafting. But other than that, and a few other things like Covenant still being stupidly cryptic, Dark Souls 3 was a triumph. I regret taking this game for granted for so long, and it really has reaffirmed me of the importance of playing a game outside the clutches of the internet. When initially released, there was so much propaganda slandering it, particularly how its linearity destroyed the experience. When you're surrounded by that much negative discourse, it infiltrates you and it makes you expect the worst. And sometimes those expectations take root, even when the game doesn't deserve it. I am guilty of being one of those people a long time ago, and this essay is my effort to repent from hastily making that judgment. DS3 took a chance on a new way to make a Souls game. It falters at times, and it's hardly a consistent experience from start to finish, but it's a game I'm truly grateful to have replayed. If there was slightly more choice to the game path, and if it cut out a few of the annoying areas and gimmick bosses, cleaned up the Covenant system, and reworked rolling so that PvP wasn't a circus act, I think this would be the quintessential Souls experience, at least for my taste. Still, I had a truly epic time with Dark Souls 3, much to my surprise, and I absolutely recommend playing it even 6 years later.